was going to be the role of Hushai while David was on the run? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Samuel on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 30 to 37. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Samuel chapter 15, beginning of verse 30. So David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up. And he had his head covered, and went barefoot. And all the people who were with him covered their heads, and went up, weeping as they went up. Then someone said to David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now it happened, when David had come to the top of the mountain, where he worshipped God, there was Hushai the Archite coming to meet him, with his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, If you go on with me, then you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously, so I will now also be your servant, then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And do you not have Zadok and Abiathar the priests with you there? Therefore it will be whatever you hear from the king's house, you shall tell the Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Indeed, they have there with them, with their two sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. In this chapter, we have been witnessing the coup staged by Absalom against his father David. We noted that for Absalom, the reason for doing so seemed to be a result of David's inaction against his brother Amnon when Amnon raped his sister Tamar. For David, though, this goes back to David's sin with Bathsheba almost a decade and a half earlier. In his punishment, God said that he would raise up an adversary from within David's house, and even though this would be gradual, God was true to his word. David understood this, which is likely why he spared Jerusalem the battle against Absalom and simply fled. But David didn't flee alone, for most of his family fled with him. Some of David's concubines stayed behind to keep the palace, as did the high priests at David's request. As for how David retreated from the city, he did so on the east, descending from Jerusalem, crossing the Kidron Valley in order to ascend the Mount of Olives. This is the same Mount of Olives that Jesus often retreated to in his life, and the mountain containing the Garden of Gethsemane. Near the Mount of Olives is likely a place where the city of Nob is, the place where the tabernacle had been in the days of Saul, and where Saul had killed many of the priests due to the incident of David and the showbread back in 1 Samuel. From the Mount of Olives, you would get the opportunity to head north to Gibeah, east towards the Judean wilderness, or northeast towards the wilderness, eventually coming to where Jericho had been. We'll see more of where David went, the Lord willing, in chapter 16. Coming to verse 30 now. When David ascended the Mount of Olives, he wept, walking barefoot and having his head covered. He was acknowledging the results of his sin that had left his moral authority in tatters, which ultimately led to his overthrow. Along the way, word came to David that Ahithophel, one of David's trusted advisors, had sided with Absalom, to which David prayed that God would turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. We don't often pray that bad things happen to other people, but it is not wrong to pray that the bad actions of bad people not succeed, for we want righteousness to prevail. Now we should preface this by saying that sometimes the Lord raises up bad people to accomplish his purpose, as he is here in punishing David. But that doesn't mean that God condones their sin, or that their sin will go unpunished. God always does do right, and righteousness will always prevail, but it will do so in God's time. For all of David's anguish, though, David wasn't mad at God. In fact, he worshipped God on top of the Mount of Olives, a sign that David still loved and trusted God even in this time of being on the run. It is here on the Mount of Olives that David runs into a good friend, a friend we hadn't met before, but a good friend of David nonetheless, Hushai, the Archite. When Hushai met David, his robe was torn and dust was on his head, a sign of sorrow. It is evident from David's words to Hushai that Hushai wanted to come with David, but David didn't want him to, because he would be a burden to David, likely because, like David, Hushai was old. Instead, David wanted Hushai to act like a spy. He was to go back to Jerusalem and tell Absalom that he would be his servant like he was a servant to David. He was then to report to David on the advice given to Absalom by Ahithophel so that it could be defeated. The way this would work is that Hushai would tell the high priests, Zadok and Abiathar, who would then tell their two sons, who would then find David and relay the messages. In this, David is asking Hushai to deceive Absalom, something that we cannot condone even in times of war, but from a human perspective, it is something we can understand, as in times of war, what we might call minor sins are often overlooked in the cause of what we consider the greater good. That doesn't mean that God overlooks them, but man often does. And this is what Hushai does with Absalom coming to Jerusalem. Let's remember this name, for it will come up multiple times in the next few chapters. So with the coup now complete, we transition to David being on the run and some of the events that surround that. So we invite you back for those lessons. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.